Brittany at Ink and Papyrus, and welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited you're here with me today because we are making some very pretty vintage papers. And you may think they look complex because they do have several different layers to them, but the process is really easy, it's really satisfying, and I guarantee you have all of the basic supplies you need to create these. So let's get started. First and foremost, to get started, you're going to want to grab a couple of basic supplies. Of course, most obvious being the papers. Now, in this video, I am choosing to use magazine papers. One, because I just got a magazine in the mail. I wasn't too wild about the images in them. And actually, I had no idea up until like yesterday when I started this project, but it is really easy to deconstruct a magazine and leave some clean edges. At least this Better Home and Gardens magazine that I got in the mail. I'm not sure about older magazines. I will show you a trick for that in just a second. So go ahead and open the magazine and just kind of fillet the pages and pat them down and really crease them nice and good. And you'll want to maybe start from the back cover, and I don't really know how else to describe it, but you'll find this like rubbery thing, how obviously it's some kind of adhesive they use to glue the magazine together. So instead of ripping the pages and getting that terrible uneven jagged edge you have to deal with and losing a quarter of the page in the process, you should be able to find that gooey edge and just pull from there. You have to be a little gentle, but you can, I think I was doing like 4, 5, 6, 7 pages at a time, and I deconstructed this magazine in no time and had very few jagged edges that I had to deal with. And I'm sorry if that's old news, but this was completely, I don't know, of all the crafting that I do with magazines, I was completely oblivious to this. So if you're like me and you've been living under a rock, I hope this helps. So thanks to that newfound little trick I just showed you, my pages don't really require a whole lot of trimming. I do have a couple of pages with some gluey end still, or a couple of pages that I did accidentally rip, and so I just trimmed them to size with a paper cutter. But really that's all there is to this. And then we have pages that we are ready to craft with. You are definitely going to want to grab a craft mat, newspaper, something like that, because it's about to get messy up in here. So how do we distress paper? Well, there are a ton of different ways and a ton of different techniques, but personally, I love just starting out with crumpled paper. There's something that looks so good about the way that the ink sinks into those little cracks and crinkles when you crumple up your paper. I don't know what it is. It looks so good. And guys, at the end of this, I know I'm using a thin paper, obviously magazine. It can be very fragile, and from that standpoint, a little difficult to work with. We're going to be using techniques that are going to cause your paper to warp and wrinkle, but at the very end, all you have to do when everything is totally dry is stick this stuff under some heavy textbooks, and it's going to straighten out really nice. So don't be afraid to warp the pages, use different techniques, play around with them. They'll wrinkle, but we're going to straighten them back out in the end, and everything will be good. In this video, I use a lot of different inks, okay? First of all, one of my favorite inks is instant coffee. Yes, all you do is take a spray bottle, put some instant coffee in, put some water in, and I always like to add some rubbing alcohol because it keeps the coffee spray from getting moldy. Okay, next I am using an assortment of Tim Holtz Distress inks. I love these. They provide a whole lot of coverage, and they seem to cover the glossy, shiny magazines well. You'll notice throughout the video that I work on multiple pages several times, and that's because this technique that I'm showing you is best done in layers. Also, you may think that you've covered enough of the text or pictures, or that you have enough depth, and then it dries and you realize you want to add more, and that's okay. And the best thing about this project is there isn't a whole lot of waiting because you're working with a whole stack of pages. And what I would encourage you to do is go ahead and distress, crinkle, maybe do some inking, or go over what you want with some white gesso or whatever gesso color you want, and set it aside to dry, and then maybe do some stamping and stenciling, and then maybe you're going to set that aside to dry, and then maybe you're going to stencil something over top or stickle and set it aside to dry. And basically you're just going to kind of go in rotation, and that way again you're never waiting on them to dry. By the next time you finish the current set that you're working on, you should be able to go back to your last set and rotate them through and complete another layer, which is why this is so much fun. And by the end of this video, you're going to have a whole stack of pages that look distressed, vintage, and that are multi-dimensional, and that is so exciting. When the pages dry, you may decide that you want to color the back as well. So there are a couple different caveats to this. Obviously, you want to make sure the front side is completely dry. Second of all, in this video, I only decorate one side because I don't think I'm going to be binding these pages into journals. If I do, we'll just cover the inside part of the page at a later time. I think I'm going to be using these more as collage papers and as pockets, tucks. Some of these look so good. I am definitely going to sew them. So it all depends on what you want to use these for. The caveat, of course, is if you're using really thin pages, i.e. magazine pages like me, you'll see that a lot of these distress inks bleed through through the other side. So you'll want to think about that if you are heart set on keeping your design on one side completely undisturbed. Don't think that you're going to be able to pat down ink and not have it come through the other side. You're going to be very, very sad. So just consider what kind of pages you're doing this with. I would say if you want different designs on the front and the back, I would consider using thicker pages. You probably will need to use cardstock, even really like computer paper. I think, or copy paper rather, I think will bleed through with the distressed inks. You guys know you've used distressed inks before. That being said, the magazine pages, I do really like them because I'm using them for collage. I think they're perfect for this project. I would say some of the distress techniques can get a little bit dicey because the magazine pages are so fragile. In this video, I'm going to be applying a bunch of water mixes. I'm going to be trying out baking soda and salt, watercolor, and certainly these kinds of techniques can really easily rip through the paper. I actually didn't have too hard of a time. I was just really gentle knowing that it was magazine page. The only thing that I think I used a sanding block to distress some of these, and I did start to kind of see that the paper was ripping a little bit, so you may be a little limited in that regard, but just be mindful of it. The other thing you can do is, if while working with these, if you find them excessively thin, after you flatten them out, you can cover the backside with some copy paper, or maybe even want to layer the magazine images. You could take some glue stick and glue some of the magazine pages to each other just to thicken them up a little bit and make them a little easier to work with. The thing that I think is so cool about these magazine pages is, even though, like I said, you can totally do this with copy paper, there's something so cool about the way that certain photos and text or colors stick out of the background, and how you don't have to, of course, you can just completely gesso or ink all over these pages, and some of those pages, that's exactly what I do. However, a lot of them still have things poking out, like this gessoed paper where I stencil a tree on top of. It was an advertisement with a forest in the background, and I completely lean into that forest green and choose to make this sort of a vintage forest page, obviously with the tree over top. And that's why I started gessoing a bunch of the page, and then I was like, well, let me just gesso over the text and kind of lean into the rest of the image that's poking out. Even if you don't necessarily like the text, the context, you know, if you gesso over it, I like that you can't, some of it, like you can't actually read it. You can just see that it was text. It kind of just adds to the mystique of the multi-dimensional, multi-layered page. When you're inking these, you can make pages with completely different appearances just by the way you spray the inks. If you spray it really, really close, you're going to get a big splotch, right? If you spray the ink from far away, you're going to get a nice fine mist. And if you spray it close and get those nice blotches, you can turn the paper side to side and allow it to run down the paper, switch directions, and create a whole design just by moving the paper around with the wet ink on it. When you're using stencils, you're likely going to have a ton of ink left over. That distress ink, it goes a long way. So what I did was take a paper that already had some dry gesso on it and went ahead and picked up that layer to just get another aspect of the stencil. There's the positive and the negative of the stencil. I can't remember which, but anyways, I pick up the opposite print of the stencil with that gesso page to add a layer to it and set it aside to dry, because I'm sure I will be adding a couple layers after that page is dry, and then I go back to the original page that I started on. And you may be asking, well, isn't this a vintage paper? Isn't that pink a little bit bright? Yes and yes, but you know what? There are no rules, and I do break away from the vintage neutrals for some brighter, bolder colors, and that's okay. I still think the pages have a nice distressed look to them, so we can still call them vintage with bright, bright, bright pops of color. You know, if you've never worked with gold gilding wax, I highly encourage you to pick up a tube, not hawking it, don't get a commission. I just have to tell you, I feel like it works wonders in terms of distressing a page and kind of bringing all the elements together, and just looks beautiful, whether you're using as the focal point or, well, like one of the focal points stenciling with it as I am, or if you just put a little bit on your finger and kind of work it into the background to give it a nice bronze look. Oh, love this stuff. And it smells, I know some people don't like the smell, but I think it smells like oranges, and I think it's divine. Even though it's probably totally toxic, oh, I love the smell. If you're stenciling onto a dark background, using light modeling paste is a perfect way to go. It adds texture. If you are stenciling modeling paste onto a light background, you may want to consider adding some ink to that modeling paste once it dries, of course, to just give a nice pop of color like it did with those flowers. I'm just going over them with some watercolors. Watercolors works perfect on modeling paste. Acrylic paint does too. I'm sure if you mix some of the distress inks over top the modeling paste, that would work as well. Gold gilding wax looks amazing over white modeling paste. Really, you know, the possibilities are endless. I'm sure even staining the white modeling paste with some coffee would look divine. The choice is totally yours. I like to apply it just with a paintbrush. It kind of keeps those clean, crisp edges. But yeah, this is a perfect way to add a pop of color. Just if you're going to be folding these into signature pages, just be careful. Know where you're going to fold it in half. Modeling paste tends not to like to be folded in half very well, so just make sure you're either doing it to the right or the left or the top or the bottom of the page away from the fold line, okay? You know, if you're kind of lost and not sure where to start, just spray some ink on the page or just start mark making with watercolor. Like especially if, in order to decide how you want to decorate these pages, maybe think about one, what kind of page it is. Do I want to cover up the entire page, or do I want to leave some of the text and the pictures popping out? That being said, then you're going to want to decide, you know, obviously what you want to cover it up, how much you want to cover up, and then if, you know, for example, it's just a white paper with text, Maybe you want to try some splatter technique and let the text poke out, or maybe you want to gesso over a portion of it. The other thing I meant to tell you guys is when you're applying the gesso, it can be tempting to kind of paint the paint on in lines, kind of like a paintbrush, but I find that it's much easier to blend the gesso into the background by kind of patting the brush. You know what I mean? Like, you'll see me do it later in the video, but just patting the brush up and down. And I noticed, because when you paint on the gesso with just exact straight lines, it just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. It just looks like a odd, poorly shaped square. But when you pat the brush down, it kind of, yeah, it just blends, especially if your page is white, it just blends into the background. And you can just it allows you to create blank splotches intermingled with text and kind of makes it look more natural. I hope that makes sense. That was a whole lot of mumbling without really saying anything. You'll play around with these techniques and you'll figure out how you like to do this. And again, depending on the kind of pages you're working with and how much of them you want to cover up, or whether you want to kind of work, like lean into the original design of the page, that'll help you decide how you want to decorate these. If you're totally stuck, just start making some marks with your markers, or some watercolor paints, some acrylic paints, maybe a charcoal pencil, or even start mark making with your stamp pad. Just start layering impressions of your stamp pad. It is a great way to get started. Maybe start gessoing around the stamp pad and then make the inside of the stamp pad your focal points. Does that make sense? And start almost creating like a grid journal. That's what I like to do when I have a white page and I'm not really sure where to go, and just text, not images, just a white magazine page with text. Just start stamping your stamp pad and gessoing around it to make the stamp pad mark the focal point, and then just start building something inside of the area of the stamped region. So I love this idea. I don't know that I have ever used lace or fabric as a stencil before, but why not? I took this lace, just fit it to size, and sprayed some distress ink over it. I wasn't sure how good the print would be, since obviously there's no way to really get the lace flush with the paper, and I thought, well, maybe it'll just look like a big blotch of ink. But I realized if you hold the ink spray further from the paper and get a really fine mist on it, you may get an amazing print. And I could not believe that this looked like real lace paper. I was absolutely thrilled with this, and I am going to definitely be trying this technique again with different laces that I have. If you're anything like me, you're thinking at this point, man, that looks ridiculous. It looks terrible. I can still see the margarita glass. It just looks trashy. And I would agree, but trust the process. Here I come in with some white gesso. I go around the imprints of the lace, and it makes everything all better. And this ended up being one of my absolute favorite prints. I don't know if the camera does this justice, but the luster of that pink distress ink is out of this world. So hopefully it makes more sense looking at it, but do you see what I mean when I say just by dabbing it, you can really blend things into each other? You're blending the gesso into the background of the page and blending the background of the page into that lace imprint with the inks. I don't know, it just tends to blend everything so much better when you dab your brush instead of trying to paint with straight lines. I hope that makes sense. That's what I was trying to say earlier. So while I had the gesso out, I went ahead and gessoed that other page. I wanted to cover not all the text, but some of the text and most of the images. This is what I mean just by trusting. When I say trust the process, just say, okay, so I have inks out. I'm gonna, do a layer of inks over these pages. Okay, I have my gesso out, and this page with the ink on it is dried. I'm gonna go gesso around, you know, these images, and you really just get into the flow and you kind of just lose yourself into the process. And again, I think that is why this project is so satisfying and so just relaxing. So essentially, if we wanted me to sum this video up in about 20 seconds, I would say trust the process, don't overthink it, add plenty of layers and dimension, and when in doubt, add more ink. And there you go. I think that is the recipe for success when it comes to making these distressed papers. Oh, and grab a bunch of stuff that you can use to add texture, whether that be fabrics or modeling paste or salt, which we're going to play with in a little bit. Wait, I know I said I would summarize this in 20 seconds, and it's probably already been a minute since I started talking. What can I say? I'm so excited about this project. I hope you guys are, as you are watching this video, I hope you've already gathered up your supplies, and I hope you are crafting right along with me. Guys, I'm telling you, if it doesn't make a mess, it's not fun anyways. Just grab your stuff, get going. This is probably the funnest project I have done in recent memory, and maybe we should do another video soon where we take our distressed papers and craft with them and make a bunch of projects out of them. What do you say? I have some things that are coming to mind. Like I said, I know I am going to use these to collage, probably make some pockets and some tucks, but surely we can do better than that, right? We could maybe make some page tabs. What if we made specimen cards out of some of these? Wouldn't that be amazing if we just cut out like a frame? We could frame photos with these. We could chop them into thin pieces. Oh, wouldn't this make such good faux washi tape? And since it's magazine page, it is so thin, we could easily wrap it up on a spool. So I would just cut this lengthwise and maybe send it through the sewing machine. So what you would do is cut a bunch of strips lengthwise and attach the strips to each other, like run it through the sewing machine with a zigzag stitch, and then you would just go along until you have a huge washi tape train and wrap it around a spool. For my washi tape spools, I just use regular like sewing thread spools when I'm out. Alternatively, you can easily make a spool by wrapping a piece of thick cardstock on itself and making like a little tube out of it and gluing it together. This is not a video about washi tape, but you guys got me off on another tangent. The point being, guys, is there are so many different things we can make from these abstract pages. You can use these as pages in your journal themselves, or you can use them as a starter for something fantastic. And I find that when you have a very interesting starter piece, it really helps build creativity, right? It inspires projects, it sparks thoughts, and because the only thing less inspiring and more soul crushing is a blank page for me, right? And once we have a starter base that we can build upon, projects just seems to kind of like create themselves from there. At least that's how I see these. I gessoed the heck out of a bunch of these pages because, you know, I don't know if you saw that salsa page. There wasn't much that I was going to do with that, the food pages. So I couldn't even really use the background to work a design into anything. I'm sure if you were super creative, you could think of something, but I opted to just really get rid of it. But the one thing I wanted to point out was you can really tamp things down with gesso. You don't necessarily need to completely cover the image, meaning make it completely opaque. You could still have little hints of words and images popping through and it being interesting without you actually being able to see what it is. I hope that makes sense. So that's why I say trust the process, create in layers. You can always add another layer of gesso. Don't obsess over it though, because you may find that that thing you thought you had to absolutely cover up adds just a little bit of some background noise to make the page even more interesting. Oh, the other thought I had in terms of other materials you can use that have a lot of So that lace was perfect because it had so many, holes and different intricate designs that there was enough of the page poking out that it didn't just look like one blob. Another thing I thought of that would create a beautiful imprint, or quote unquote stencil, would be like the fruit knitting. You know, the knitting that you get your apples and oranges and like lemons in? That would create a beautiful pattern, I think, if you put it over the page and sprayed some distress oxide on it, things like that. So I am truly loving these, but there's still some other techniques that we have to try. And a lot of these pages, well, some of them are done and some of them I think still need another layer of magic added to them. Some of them are still kind of dull looking. So let's try adding some texture and some dimension with a few more techniques. I thought printing with this blue, I think it's called like Blue Sketch or something, Blueprint something. It's a Tim Holtz ink. I was a little worried I was gonna ruin my beautiful lace print, and I thought, well, this might be a little much, but I think the brown and the blue go together wonderfully, and honestly, I don't think the camera really does this print justice. So the other technique we'll talk about here is very simple. As you can see, I am stamping off of the page to give it some extra dimension. Go ahead and maybe just use half of your stamp. Use a variety of different stamps. If you don't want the stamp to be the focal point and maybe blend into the background, consider putting the ink on your stamp and then wetting the stamp, and it will blur the imprint. Alternatively, you could wet the stamp and then put it, face side up, and then just lay your paper on top of it and kind of smooth it out, and that will also give you a blurry impression. It's another way to add layers and dimension to your prints. Or maybe even some crumpled up threads just spread throughout your pages. See, you don't have to have fancy stencils. You can make beautiful impressions and quote unquote stencils just from objects you have lying around your house. Like I was saying earlier, if you don't have access to these distress inks, which, if there was a couple of supplies in my craft room, I feel like I have to have. I love using these distressed inks. They create so much, they give so much pigment, and they go a really, really, really long way. But you can easily make your own dyes, and I do that as well. Instant coffee, like I said, add some rubbing alcohol to the spray bottle to keep it from molding. Same thing with instant tea. You can boil some beets down to get that really, really, really nice red color. Again, add some rubbing alcohol, play around with that. There are tons of different colors in nature that you can use to create some awesome pigments. I've tried using makeup before, pigments from like old eyeshadows and blushes, and though again it gives you a really good pigment, I think it's better made into a paste. Every time I've tried to use it in a spray bottle, it kind of just those sprayers are so temperamental. They tend to clog the spray plungers. So I haven't had great success with that. My favorite go-to in terms of creating my own dyes is food coloring. It is a very cheap source of pigment. I'm trying to think of and again, it goes such a long way, just a couple of drops, and you've created yourself an ink. I'm trying to think. There's just a ton of different things you can use. Just look around your pantry. I guarantee you anything where you're like, oh gosh, that would leave a stain. Yep, you can make a dye out of it. If you have ink left over on your stencils, maybe lean into it. In a couple of these projects, I decided to apply some modeling paste, and will stencil with modeling paste, and I left the brown and the red ink on the stencil, and that way I got a beautiful tinted modeling paste without having to do any mixing at all. Just a thought. I also am very lazy and I'll find any excuse not to clean my stencils. This is a great way to do that, and To get all the modeling paste off, I simply took another paper that did not have much on it and put it over the modeling paste to pick up the print. Sometimes I'll spray them with water, and you can pick up an easier, a better print that way. And it's funny, it like doesn't leave, modeling paste. It'll give you some dimension and texture. And when I sprayed the stencil with water, I picked up just enough modeling paste to get a stencil imprint, but not enough to actually get any rise on the paper. So I don't know, but I thought it had a really cool effect. Okay, for our next technique, we are using baking soda as a colorant and for a little bit of gritty texture. I played with this a couple of different ways, and then I realized very quickly the easiest way to do this is to actually take a wet brush, layer some water down first, sprinkle the baking paste over later. It gives kind of a yellow hue on the paper I'm working on. I don't think it's going to be as noticeable because I sprayed it down with some of that like pewter mica distress ink. But in general, the baking soda tends to yellow certain papers. Again, the magazine pages had sort of ink on them before, so instead of using it as like an aging mechanism, I'm using it more for that gritty sandpaper kind of feel. But I would encourage you to play around with different kinds of papers and see if you can get that yellowing effect. Some people will say that if you can enhance this effect by kind of baking them. I don't know if that works. I've never tried it myself. But like adding the baking soda or baking powder and then baking it in the oven. Let me know what you guys think if you've played around with this. I definitely want to play around with this technique more. More than anything, I felt like just kind of gritting that powder into the paper actually caused it to have this like weathered, washed look almost, and I really, really liked it. So I added that baking soda to a couple of different pages once I kind of got the technique down with the adding it to a piece of paper that's already wet. I was a lot happier with the results. Again, of course, you're adding water to magazine. It's going to wrinkle, and you have to be careful not to rip it. But I'm telling you, once I was done with designing all of these pages and I let them dry and then I added textbooks to them, I couldn't believe how well they flattened out. So I wouldn't let that deter you from playing around with different mixed mediums. I really wasn't sure how this was going to turn out, especially since I left so much of the magazine images peering out, but a lot of them were pictures of brown things and picture frames in neutral colors, and I felt like this would fit into the vintage theme perfectly. Plus, if I didn't like it, we could always cover it up. I also felt like the grittiness of the baking powder would really kind of help tampen down all of the images going on in the background, so it wouldn't be so busy, but you could still get the general hues and general feel for the images underneath. I'm probably overthinking it, but that's just kind of how I approach this. And again, like I said, don't overthink the process, because if you don't like how it comes out, well, as soon as it's dry, you can add another layer and you can keep working it until you are blue in the face or until you are happy with your image, I guess whichever comes first. Like I said, the baking powder really works best on a wet surface. I didn't wet the surface mostly because I didn't really want to bleed the stencil images I had created, and so I went ahead to basically distress this image just by mushing the baking powder in, kind of wetting my finger and going over it, and it did help kind of tampen down the background images. This is another way you can use it to your advantage to really blend things into the background. It is essentially a gesso light, I guess. It certainly doesn't cover things like gesso, but it can certainly kind of blend things in, tampen things down. You get the point. The other way to do this is with the sanding block. I do end up using a sanding block on some of the pages, though again, you're very limited because magazine paper is very fragile. It rips very easily. So even though I was able to get kind of a nice weathered look with the sanding block, I really wasn't able to I was kind of thinking I would be able to use it more of an eraser, and I definitely didn't get much erasing of the images. I felt like the magazine paper was going to rip at any moment, so I just kind of stopped. But if you're working with sturdier paper, a sanding block could definitely be your friend if you're going for that nice weathered look. Salt is another great way to give something a nice gritty look. You can change the texture a little bit if you sprinkle some salt over and then spray the distress ink over that. Alternatively, if you were starting with a wet surface, if you put some water down on your paper, put some salt on, and then spread some watercolor over, it definitely changes the way the watercolor goes on your paper. Just a couple of different ideas, again, for adding some layers, some texture, some dimension. Again, I was kind of using it as a gritty component to try and lighten up some of the text. And again, the more grittier I rubbed it into the paper, the more I felt like the magazine was on the verge of breaking. It certainly gave it a little bit more of a washed, weathered look, but it didn't do much for a lightening text. Again, that may be different if you're working on a sturdier paper and can really mash that sand or the salt. Sand would be another great way to go. But if you can mash that salt into the paper, frail pages such as magazines, you're a little bit limited in the ways we can use these mediums. So I loved this beautiful blue print that I created from the stencil of that tree with the blue distress ink, but I knew it needed a little bit more. I wanted to kind of shift attention away from those two images that were obviously still very visible. And the way I did this is by adding some other focal points, and I knew that they would really have to pop to kind of drown those images into the background. And the best way to do this is by using something, a color that really pops. And in this case, it was gold gilding wax. I thought that would, I mean, gold gilding wax, you could gild a turd and it would look terrific. But in this case, the gold really looks gorgeous against that blue background. And so, but I didn't want it to be too busy, so I used my script stamp. It is handwriting that doesn't actually spell out a word. And for whatever reason, I just find that it also kind of keeps things neutral, not too busy, and just really blends everything together very nicely. You know, that one page that I put some prints on, I think I picked up the imprint of the tree stencil and had all that food around it. I was like, what am I going to do with this? At the time, I was kind of more just looking to clean off my stencil. I didn't think I could do anything with this print because who wants a tree over some food? But I realized having the tree poke out on that white background on the sides and then gessoing the actual food, it kind of like created a grid for itself, and basically it gave me a really pretty background of a tree with some text over top and four almost framed things to do whatever I wanted with them. And I leaned into that and put eventually, I guess not right here, you can't see, but I stenciled some gold leaves over top, and I felt like everything came together. It just fit. It came together really nice, and that's the beauty of this project. You don't necessarily know where your images, where your papers are going at the time. You just have to do the next cool thing, right? You just have to put on a layer and then complement that layer and tie something together and maybe complement it with another color. And it truly is, I know it sounds cliche, but if you just keep going, you're going to end up with a print that you really love. This plan page I thought was really cool because, as you remember earlier maybe, this was a really busy page with a ton of different plans on it and a bunch of text on the sides. And I whittled it down with the gesso to create a single focal point, being that palm leaf on the page. And I just thought it was so cool because I actually used, this is one of the very few magazine pages that I actually used an image on the magazine as a focal point as opposed to, you know, blending the background, I guess, so to speak. And I just used gesso to do that, to frame that leaf and to get rid of all the text that was kind of distracting, and created my own, and of course added some gold on the page that gave it that real like vintage vibe, some script text, some postage stamps, and that's really all it took to transform this page. Once I had finished up the blueprint, and yes, this turned out to be one of my absolute favorite prints, I started scanning through my stack of prints that I had remaining. I'd sort of formed a pile of prints that I felt like were complete. Doesn't mean you can't still go back later and add, but prints I felt were complete and prints I felt like needed extra help. And as I would go along and try a new technique, I would say, oh gosh, I remember that print, needed some extra layers, or that print needed a focal point, or that print, needed some extra gesso to kind of blend those pictures out in the background. And so I would just grab those prints off the top and just kind of keep rolling with it. And again, like, I had several prints where I had started to put some ink and kind of started to create a base, but they needed a lot of help. And I love that forest picture so much. I wanted to sort of replicate that. So that one print that I had with all that green in the background, I leaned into it. I covered the text with some gesso, and I sort of just created a base for myself. And again, make sure you're using that light dabbing motion. It is the best way to kind of blend that gesso in the background and make it look intentional, as opposed to a half painted blob, if you know what I mean. It also gives it some nice texture, gives it that nice little raised cloud, fluffy appearance, if you will. So as I scan through, I pull out a couple of prints that need a little bit of TLC still, but really I couldn't believe how quickly these gorgeous vintage prints came together. And again, the process was so fun, it was so relaxing, and I can't wait to use these in my journals. Like I said, some of these are going to be the base for the beginning of some other awesome new projects. Maybe we will do a future video on that. Don't forget, once your prints are all dry, smush that textbook on top of them to flatten them out, especially if they're thin pages like the ones that I used. You will love the results. So guys, thank you so much for coming along with me as I went on this journey to create some gorgeous prints that I could use in my journals. If you enjoyed this and found value in this, please hit that like and subscribe button, and I can't wait to see you the next time.